Welcome to Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions. I'm Trevor Bechtel, facilitator of this series with Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan and instructor of the course that accompanies this lecture series. Over these next 3 weeks, we will introduce key issues regarding the causes and consequences of poverty in the United States, featuring experts in policy and practice from across the nation. We are an audience of students enrolled in our course, community members, academics, policymakers, and interested people from Southeast Michigan and beyond. And we are really excited about today's presentation from Jonathan Cohn, presented in partnership with UM's Institute for Healthcare Policy and Innovation. But before we dig into the conversation, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions and comments in the comment box to the right on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag #UMPovertySolutions. We look forward to a meaningful conversation. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue and want to let folks know we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. I invite you to check out our resources, tune in for additional events, and find other ways to connect with other poverty research at our website, poverty.umich.edu. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Luke Schaefer, Herman and Amalie Cohn, Professor of Social Justice and Social Policy and Director of Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Trevor. I appreciate that and appreciate everything you and the team does to put this series together. And I'm really delighted to have my good friend and colleague, someone I admire a great deal, with us today, Jonathan Cohn. He's a senior national correspondent for HuffPost. He has been at the New Republic. He's written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, and Self. And he's written a number of really important books. And today, the impetus for today's session was about his book, The 10-Year War, Obamacare and the Unfinished Crusade for Universal Coverage. It's a book that has come out, I think, in the last year. And I'll say just two things about it before I ask Jonathan a couple questions, and then we're going to get to your questions too. The first is, I love books that are really policy wonky, that sort of make the details come to life, and I can really understand policy in a new way. And I also really love sort of political tell-all stories, like how did something get through Congress and how do presidents think of policy issues. And this book is one that does both of those types of things exceptionally well. So you get the give and take of the political process of how ACA became law, and you also get all of the policy details in a really readable way. So I have found that the 10-Year War is a really great stocking stuffer and a great birthday present as well. So Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. And yes, we're getting to holiday gift season. I hadn't thought about that. So thank you for the plug.
It's perfect. Maybe a little bit big to fit into a stocking, but
has to be a big, like a boot size stocking. I think.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. Right. Or any other way you celebrate, I think it would be a well-received gift.
Yes.
So, Jonathan, I wonder if you could just take us back in time a little bit. I've often think about the fact that our present policy decisions are sort of shaped by what's come before. And I'm wondering if you could just at a high level tell us, how did we end up with employer-based health insurance as sort of the dominant form that people got their health insurance? And how has that affected all of the debates that we've had ever since?
Yeah. Well, that's such a good question. And I think lots of people, I think it's one of the first things that happens whenever anybody starts to think about, if you get seriously into a discussion of healthcare, at some point early on, everyone's like, wait, why do we have this? Why are we getting insurance through jobs, so many of us? So the story, you have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, which is really when we first have health insurance come into existence. And that is because it's the first time that medicine has become really kind of powerful and successful, and you can really we have the ability to cure people, and hospitals are in a way we really didn't back in the 19th century. And so healthcare is finally getting expensive because it can actually make you better.
And do something. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but now all of a sudden people can't afford it. So you had to come up with a way to finance it, because, you know, and especially came true in the late 1920s when the Great Depression hit, because a bunch of hospitals had gone on these building binges, and they suddenly had these wards full of patients that couldn't pay their bills. Now, one of the things that they set up a commission to study how healthcare economy of healthcare works. And one of the things they discovered is this sort of this basic rule of health economics. I think it's like the equivalent to health economics of like E equals MC squared to physics, which is that in any large group of people at any one time, most of the spending on healthcare is concentrated among a very small group of people, right? It's the people who are older, who have serious chronic diseases, have been in an accident. I mean, that's where most of your spending is at any one time. Because, you know, most of us, if we're healthy, we're just getting checkups. You get a broken arm here and there, whatever. It's not very expensive to treat that. But over time, that population will shift, right? Some people will get sick, they'll get healthy. And so if you pool resources together in a group, you can finance healthcare for everybody because everybody pays a modest amount, and then there's enough money to cover the bills of whoever has the serious medical needs. Now, every other country where this is true everywhere, in every other country they said, oh, well, okay, solution is let's get everyone into one big, you know, we'll have a national health system. For complex political reasons, it was not possible to do that, or at least it was thought not to be possible to do that in the 1920s, 1930s. So we did not take that step. But you still had the problem that the hospitals were like going bankrupt. And so actually the story is there's a hospital in Dallas, Texas, where they're trying to figure out how to pay the bills. And the administrator there used to run the Dallas school teachers. And he was superintendent of the Dallas school system. And he says, well, what if I like went to, he said, you know, he kind of thought this scheme, we'd go to the schools and we'll say, hey, the teachers, we'll get you all to sign up. You'll pay a little bit of money. And then my hospital will provide you with healthcare to anyone who has signed up for this. And basically the first modern insurance plan. And the legend has it, the first person to get payment was a teacher who on Christmas Day, she slipped on the ice and broke her ankle, went to the hospital, and they said it, and she didn't pay anything because she was part of the plan. So this model of like building around an employer worked, right? Because it's a large group of people randomly selected. And basically that system was copied over and over again. And in fact, in the Minneapolis version of it, they decided to advertise it with a blue cross on the poster, which is how we got the whole Blue Cross system. So that's how the system sort of was born. Over time, there were a number of policy decisions that kind of encourage, that kind of tried to steer in the direction. The best known is that there was a tax decision that if you pay, an employer provides you with health insurance, that doesn't count towards your income. So that made it more valuable. And basically that and some other decisions, you end up by the 1950s with a large share of the working age population is getting coverage for them and their family members through employers. And now it's in place. And this is the thing. And there's a word, you know, called path dependence, you know, in political science for this. So that system is in place. Now, if you're going to change it, you have to deal with the fact that there's a large group of people who have insurance, are reasonably content with it. So you got to convince them that if you're going to take that, if you're going to replace that, you got to convince them that it's actually better. And that's actually quite hard to do.
So people, when we think about policy, people are risk averse. If they have something and they are, as you say, reasonably content with it, it's a bigger threshold to say, we want you to try this different thing that's going to be better for all of us. Maybe it's not going to be quite as good for you, but maybe it is going to be better for you. But it creates a sort of barrier. And that sort of seems like it comes into place in the system without any sort of national intentionality. It was, you know, innovation by this guy in Dallas, and then it sort of picks up in other places, right? And nobody made a decision to say, hey, we're going to have an employer-based health insurance system. It just picked up momentum, as you said. So what happens in the 1990s? And so what are some of the problems that we're seeing with the system? You know, coverage is growing, you know, more people are getting health insurance through their employer from its inception to, you know, throughout the rest of the century. why does Bill Clinton decide to take this on as a major issue? And then maybe just walk us through what happens in that part of the story.
Yeah, sure. So by the 90s, the employer system is now firmly in place, right? I mean, this is the primary source of private health insurance. Now, obviously, that leaves out a lot of people. There's people who are retired. There's people who don't have jobs. So in the 1960s, the government created two very big programs to kind of to take care of this. They created Medicare, which created a universal system for the elderly, right? And it's just a straight up government run insurance program for everyone over 65. And then they created Medicaid, which was a partnership with the states where they would cover some people who are poor and don't have jobs. It was really initially very narrowly targeted only at the same groups that got, the sort of traditional quote, welfare population. So pregnant women, children, etc. And kind of by like the 70s and 80s, you got to a situation where 80 to 90% of the country had insurance. Now, there's always been concern about the people left out. But, it was, most people had coverage and there was a bit of a stability there. But it starts to break down by the 90s for a couple of reasons. One is that healthcare just gets much more expensive. And there's a whole literature on why that happened and what factors were at work. But it just got so expensive that for employers, it became like we're up to that point. Employers were very happy to throw health insurance at their employees. It was a good way to retain workers. They started to get much more skittish about it. You saw more companies doing things like, okay, I'm going to bring in contractors instead of full-time workers because I don't have to pay them.
To avoid those costs.
Yeah. And there was a recession in the late 80s, early 90s, and people are losing their jobs. And so they're losing their health coverage, which then feeds into the second problem, which is that for people who aren't connected to a job and don't fall into the categories of Medicare or Medicaid or, like the Veterans Administration, one of these other programs out there, you have to buy insurance on your own. And that's a very different, unique market because insurers figured out early on that that the only way to make money and make a lot of money was to be very selective about the kind of insurance they sold and who they sold it to. And in particular, they didn't want to sell to people with pre-existing conditions because they knew that people with pre-existing conditions were going to have big medical bills and that's going to cost you a lot of money. So they tried, they basically would exclude people if they had pre-existing conditions. And you can call it greed, you can call it a very rational reading of the market. If they weren't selective about this, they would have to raise their rates for everybody. So you had this problem where you had a growing number of people who couldn't get insurance. Even people who had insurance are facing higher costs because it's getting more expensive. And in comes Bill Clinton. And, at this point, Harry Truman had tried to do a national health insurance plan. And the dream had always been, let's do it like other countries do and just have one government program for everybody or something administered like that. So kind of like Medicare is for seniors. And partly because the problems we just discussed,
Did he call it Medicare for all or no?
What's that?
Did he call it Medicare for all or?
I don't actually think Harry Truman called it Medicare for all. I'm trying to remember, actually. I don't think it is. That name kind of is a recent, as far as I know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. It's a good name. I'd say marketing. It's great. I personally think it's a great marketing name, and health policy, frankly, known not for doing that very well.
You mean they overcomplicate things and make it hard?
Yeah. The ACA itself, like it's the Patient Protection Afford. Just not the greatest buzzword there. Anyway, so Clinton, like their theory is, okay, we can't do this. We're not gonna be able to replace this, and also at this point, politically, economically, even most Democrats don't want to do too much government. Like this is a period when everyone's really enthralled to the idea that markets are better than government. So there's really not a lot, except for like the real diehard left side of the political spectrum. There just isn't much enthusiasm in the political class for doing Medicare for all or something like that. So they basically try to work for a system that would use private insurance to get everyone universal coverage. And they worked really hard on it. And people forget there was a moment in 1993 when it looked like this thing was going to happen. He gave this speech. Clinton gave this very famous speech before Congress. It was a classic Bill Clinton speech that was, whatever. And then the whole thing fell apart. And there's a lot of reasons why it did. But, a few of the big ones are, number one, it actually, even though it was relying on private insurance, it was going to move a lot of people out of their existing employer plans. And that freaked people out. In addition, they were very serious about trying to control the cost of care in a very aggressive way. Well, that basically alienated and made enemies of every part of the healthcare industry, the drug industry, the insurers. Some were like more favorable early on, like the doctors, but even they got cold feet. Employers were furious. And that was a huge, massive wall of opposition that was very difficult to overcome. They took forever. The White House sat. I mean, there was also like just the way they put the bill together. The White House spent months and months crafting this plan and then brought it to Congress. And if you know anything about Congress, like Congress does not like to work that way.
They like that little say.
Yeah. And Democrats were all over the place in terms of what they wanted on Capitol Hill, and really hadn't really gotten on the same page about even the basic structure of the system. So they were divided. And then, they ran into, really stiff opposition from Republicans. They ran into the beginning of what we now think of as the right-wing media universe, which back then was really, it was like Rush Limbaugh, and it was there was or talk radio, and frankly, a lot of distortion about what was in the proposal that they were not able to counteract. And you kind of threw that all together. And the thing fell apart, and it was such a traumatic, because they got killed in the midterms. They lost control of the House and Senate for the first time in a very long time. It was such a traumatic event.
It was 50 years. 40 years at least.
Yes. No Democrat in power wanted to go anywhere near a national healthcare plan for years. They were so traumatized, and it was like just thought to be radioactive. Like if you worked on healthcare reform, you basically walked out of there thinking, I probably won't get to do this for 10, 20 years at best.
Yeah.
Because no one wants to touch it again.
So why does Barack Obama come around to say, actually, this is something I'm going to take on?
Yeah. So this is, 2008. So we're more than 10 years later.
Fast forward.
And a few things have happened. The political circumstances have started to change. Again, Democrats are getting majority control. And I think it's important to recognize that each party has its most cherished causes. And universal coverage is in the DNA of the Democratic Party. For all the arguments over how to do it, and some are more enthusiastic. I mean, it was Harry Truman's crusade, right? Yeah. It's Lyndon Johnson and Medicare and Bill Clinton. I mean, this is, why do you become a Democrat? I mean, it's a very core principle at a level of Democrats believe healthcare should be a right, and they believe the government should guarantee that right. And they differ about how high a priority and how to do it. But fundamentally, that is a core Democratic Party belief. There's not going to be a time when they have a chance to legislate, and they're not going to at least think about doing something that moves them towards there. So I think that's number one. Number two, the problems have gotten worse. More people had lost insurance. Health insurance had gotten more expensive. And it was very clear that, it was going to keep getting worse unless somebody did.
The trajectory was not good. Yeah.
Obama personally, and it's funny because I'm a policy journalist, so I tend not to get too caught up in individuals. Like so much of Washington coverage I feel like is this personality or that personality. But especially in writing this book, it really hit me that personalities do matter.
Yeah, you're right about this.
Yeah. And Obama had some personal experiences with his mother when she was sick. He also had spent time in local politics and as community organizer, hearing things. I mean, one of the things I mentioned this in the book, there's a great video from right when he's first elected to the state Senate. And it's hilarious. The first thing you notice is, he looks not that different, but he definitely looks younger. And he's wearing a suit that's clearly like about a size and a half too big, like the sleeves, and he has that kind of like, when I was in my 20s, that's pretty much what I would have looked like if I was. And it was like a local cable access, and it's just so funny. Yeah. But, he's saying the same things he would say as president. He's like, I'm talking to my constituents, people can't afford health insurance. And he made a big deal about the fact, a lot of these people, they're working, and that's how he said it, right? He always does the working. It's part of his, downstate, talking, a lot of people are working and they got two jobs and they can't get health insurance, and that's not fair. And, so he felt, and he's also his kind of core, and I talk about some of this. I mean, his belief of how the world should work is one where like people aren't left out, and he saw that as a form of being left out. So that was important. And then the last thing was, even though the Democratic Party at the high level wanted nothing to do with healthcare, the people who work on policy, the activists, the experts, the advocates, the staff on health, they were working on it constantly because they knew they would get another chance at some point. And
they thought it was going to come up again.
Yeah. And they really spent 10 years coming up with a plan that they thought could hit the sweet spot of good policy and good politics, or let's put it this way, good enough policy and good enough politics.
Yeah.
And that meant that when Democrats had their chance to pass laws, when Obama gets elected, they control the White House, they control the Senate, they control the House. They were ready to go. They were on the same page. There were a million questions to be answered. There was a very complex, process of building support for it. But they were ready to go. They were waiting, and that process, is so important. And you see the sort of flip side of that later when Republicans tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I always say that one of their biggest problem was they did none of that work. They were not ready to go, and it really showed.
So when I think about that, I'm sort of imagining conferences held at think tanks, and there's white papers and like all the wonky stuff that has, been a pretty big part of my life, not on this, issue as much, but, and it seems like you're saying that like all of that work went into a formula, and they really took this sort of position of saying, we know what would actually be the very best policy structure, or, at a high level, but we also know we probably can't get there from here. So we're going to try to marry the best policy with, what has a chance of passing, so that when the moment arose, you sort of imagine them sort of like doing this, thinking that moment's going to happen again, but not knowing exactly when.
Yeah.
They would be ready.
Yeah. That was not just implicitly, that was explicitly the goal. I mean, they've been, the mindset of the Democratic Party, early 2000s, who worked on healthcare, was we have been hitting our heads against the wall trying to do this for, most of the 20th century, and we have not succeeded. The only time we succeeded was partially with Medicare, which was a compromise on a compromise. We need to find a way. We need to not hold out for the best. We need to figure out the best we can do and craft a policy with all of the political constraints we understand that exist. And this was the position of the activists who were going to those think tank conferences, which they mattered, right? All those, I talk about some. There's like a very seminal publication put out by a group that's funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. That's really in like protean form, the sort of framework of what would eventually become the ACA. So that stuff matters.
Mm-hmm.
But, and it was also the position of the people in Congress. And I always think of two people in particular who figure very prominently in the book who had this belief, which is Ted Kennedy and Henry Waxman. Ted Kennedy was the senator from Massachusetts, Waxman, the congressman from California. Kennedy chairs the Health Committee in the Senate, Waxman, the Energy and Commerce in the House. And both had a lifetime of working on healthcare. I mean, they're really single-handedly had done as much as anybody in Washington to expand healthcare access. And both, left to their own devices, would happily have created what we now call Medicare for all or something like that. They're both very liberal, but both of them were convinced, and this was the belief of Nancy Pelosi, it was the belief of Harry Reid, and certainly the belief of Barack Obama, that they could not get that. And they were not going to walk away with nothing. They were going to get the best game. And Kennedy in particular believed this because in the early 1970s, there was a brief window when Nixon was president, actually, when it looked like
great liberal.
Yes. There was a brief moment when it looked like there'd be a bipartisan Nixon-Kennedy deal. And it fell apart for a number of reasons. But one of them was that Democrats basically lost interest because Watergate had already happened. And there was a sense that we're going to get big gains in the midterms. We'll be able to do something better in 2 years if we just wait. And of course, didn't happen. And Kennedy, his entire career, when you asked him his biggest regret as a lawmaker, as a legislator, he always said, I wish we had found a way to make that work because that's as close as we've come. And so he was not going to let another chance like that go by, especially because if you remember, and I talk about this in the book, early in the process, he gets diagnosed with brain cancer that eventually took his life. So he literally knew this was his last chance. He was very explicit about that. And he was determined that to help get the project over the line somehow.
I know it's an incredibly complicated bill, but maybe in thinking about, some of the drivers of what it's doing, some of the reasons, the DNA of like universal coverage and the costs, can you sort of give us the very quick summary of what ACA did and maybe some of its results since then? Have we seen declines in people being uninsured?
Yeah. So I mean, the basic principles are everyone should have insurance. The insurance should be good enough to get you access to care, and that you shouldn't face financial struggle because you have healthcare needs and have to get medical care. That we should be working towards making the system as a whole more efficient, higher quality, and cost less, so we have money for other things, and we're not just throwing good money after bad. That's the overall goal. I mean, that's the sort of summary of what I tried to do. Again, for a variety of political reasons, very much related to the path dependence we talked about before, the decision was made to work within the existing system. So they basically said, okay, for people who are low income, we already have a program called Medicaid. Let's just expand it to cover everyone who lives below or just above the poverty line. Let's leave employer insurance. Let's leave Medicare in place for the elderly. So now you're dealing with the working age population that's above the poverty line. And you say, basically, let's leave that in place. Let's leave employer coverage in place for people who have it and like it. But let's reorganize that small part of the market for what we were talking about before, people buying on their own. And it's all now a fairly small portion of the population, but it gets like 90% of the attention about the Affordable Care Act, which is they reorganized this market. They created an online system where you could buy insurance, which most places it's healthcare.gov. If you live in California or Massachusetts or some other states, they have their own Covered California, which they run themselves, but it's the same basic deal. And you go there, and basically the insurance there, it's a standard insurance that they can't deny because of pre-existing conditions. It has to cover a minimum set of benefits. Depending on how much money you make, you get subsidized, so it's cheaper. And every year you get to renew it or get a different plan. And the hope was this would, cover most Americans. And in addition to that, on the back end, there was a bunch of stuff designed to get the cost of healthcare coming down. No one thought it was going to instantly cause prices to plummet. But the hope was, if you're sort of thinking ahead to the future and healthcare spending was going to go like this, if you were looking on a curve, then maybe you could get it to go like this.
Bend the curve.
Bend the curve, right. So how did it do? Well, it's kind of easy to see what it didn't do, right? So, I mean, we still have a lot of people who don't have health insurance, a lot of people who have health insurance but really high deductibles, or their premiums are kind of hard. People who are eligible for Medicaid, who are at or below the poverty line but can't get Medicaid or have trouble getting Medicaid. And actually the cost of care is still going up. And I will tell you that for every one of those, I can explain to you why the program wasn't as successful as originally hoped. There's a variety of reasons. A lot of it has to do with the design. In a story that will sound familiar to anyone following the current debate, there was a lot of pressure not to spend too much money. So they sort of clawed back how much financial assistance people buying those healthcare.gov policies would get. So they turned out to be pretty expensive for a lot of people. A lot of states decided not to expand Medicaid. There's still a dozen that haven't. Here in Michigan, we're one of the ones that have. But states like Alabama, Florida, Texas have not. And the cost driver stuff is always the hardest part. And just some of that stuff got repealed. Some of it hasn't worked that well. But the flip side is number of Americans without health insurance is the lowest ever. We are much closer to universal coverage than we've ever been. And we now have a fairly solid body of evidence. A lot of it actually from here in Michigan, people affiliated with IHPI, who I know is, it's
one of our co-sponsors.
Plug for the sponsor, but deserved. That has shown that the people who got Medicaid in particular, but also to some extent, even people who got private insurance or healthcare.gov, they are more financially secure. They have better access to care, and they're actually healthier. And one of the best studies is actually, it's by someone who's actually now in the Obama administration, but looked at some of the early data from Massachusetts, which was like the pilot program version of this before they passed the ACA, and comparing it to some other states, and found that, a fairly, actually saving lives at a fairly healthy clip. So, it's a very flawed program that's left us with many of the problems we had before. And, people are, and lots of people who still can't afford health insurance, people are just aggravated and frustrated because it is aggravating and it is frustrating. And that's why we're still talking about healthcare, and why Bernie Sanders is out there saying we still need Medicare for all. And even people who don't agree with that are saying we still need to do more. There's like lots of problems out there still. And yet we're like, if your measure is, are people Did more people get coverage? Do they have better access to care? Are they healthier? The answer is yes, and yes, and yes. And comparatively, at least, I mean, you can argue whether it was worth the money, depending on whether this kind of government program is bad or good, depending on your philosophical. But if you're just measuring that impact on insurance coverage, certainly the biggest step in that direction since the 1960s in Medicare and Medicaid, and arguably just as important, although regional people, I think, can disagree about that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, that was just such a great tour through the history of this issue. And I think gave folks a really good sense of how this all fits together. We have a question from Amaya Walker, who is asking, she's asking that, reflecting on the fact that people in other countries accept sort of the universal healthcare idea, and just wondering, like, could you imagine a scenario where we get to a place where most Americans would want to switch? So we've talked about path dependency, but could you imagine, are we really just sort of locked in for perpetuity, or would there ever be a path to that?
Yeah. What was it Yogi Berra said? I never make predictions, especially about the future. So I would certainly say past experience makes me skeptical we can make it in one big jump. Not impossible, maybe there's a, dramatic change in politics, and that that we just don't foresee. But it would be unusual given our history. It would be surprising given our history if we could make that big kind of leap. I do think, and that I can imagine a scenario where we get close to that, or some kind of system like they have in Europe, in a series of steps. I always, and I'm not the first person to say this, but if you think of universal healthcare, two things. Number one, it doesn't have to look exactly like Medicare for all. I mean, there are countries that do that, where the government insures everyone directly, like we sort of do in Medicare. Taiwan is like that, right? So it's what the wonks will call a single payer system. Everyone gets insurance directly from the government. Sweden has a system like that. But a lot of countries with universal coverage have different systems, where, in the Netherlands, it's kind of like what the Clintons originally imagined. Everybody picks a private insurance plan. In, various countries, France and Germany have different kinds of sickness funds, although France is a little more like a single payer system. And France, you have more of a single payer system, but also it's a hybrid where the government kind of covers the basics, and then everybody picks supplemental policies to fill in the gaps, which is actually a lot like our Medicare system runs. So there's different versions of that. And you can imagine turning the dials on our system in various ways to get us closer to that, so that, 2 or 3 steps from now, we're at one of those systems. But I think it probably takes time.
So sort of incrementally moving closer and closer to that type of goal.
That feels more likely to me. But, I could be wrong.
So Michelle Rudeshevsky, I'm sorry, Michelle R., she mentions wondering about how the ACA was impacted through the Trump presidency and through years of Republican control. So much, I mean, I remember at the time there was so much focus on, like, we're going to repeal ACA, we're going to replace ACA. And I mean, I think a lot of people, like, in 2016 thought it was a done deal, right? That ACA was going to be repealed, it was going to be lost. But that doesn't end up happening. So you write about this in your book. Maybe you can take us through that a little bit.
Yeah. So, the assumption, no one who was responsible for crafting the Affordable Care Act, and this includes President Obama, thought it was anywhere close to perfect, or that it was done. I mean, everyone sort of assumed that it would go through a period of, that would be kind of the starter home, as they like to call it, and they would build on it. And, any large policy is going to have, you're going to pass the policy, and then you're going to start to implement it, and things are going to look different, right? Something's not going to work. It's the nature of the enterprise. So normally you're going to tweak it, and you're going to modify it, and so the hope was you could at least do that work for the first few years. And then, at some point, get together with Congress and say, all right, you know what? Looking back, we should have done more of X, or we didn't think about Y. Let's modify the program in this way. And that's been the history.
Like you were just describing, an incremental process towards a greater whole.
A fine tuning, like you would do with your starter house, right? Like, okay, let's remodel this room. Ooh, why did we put the window there? Let's move it to here. And oh, we didn't realize we had a rain problem there. We're going to have to add a gutter. And okay, now I'm talking about my house. But yes, that's that was the idea of the law. And there was a reasonable expectation that because that had been the way up to that point in American history programs generally ran. Medicare drug benefit is an example of a program where, it actually passed with some bipartisan support, even though it was mostly a Republican bill. And even the Democrats who were against it afterwards, were sort of constructive in helping it to work and sort of worked on patches. And, it was sort of understood to be, okay, well, the law's in place. Let's make it work as well as we can. And, we'll argue about how to change it over time. That did not happen with the Affordable Care Act. It was a symptom of, and I guess maybe to some extent a contributing factor towards the polarization we see. And there was just no room to do anything legislatively to improve the program. And not only that, there were various efforts at undermining it, some of which for complex political reasons actually got through Congress. And basically, instead of spending the remainder of Obama's term improving it and fortifying it and fixing its problems, it was basically this ongoing fight to prevent it from being undermined.
Playing defense.
Yeah, playing defense. To be clear, some of this self-inflicted because they made some big errors, especially with the website, which we can talk about later if you want. But
website didn't roll out that well. Yeah.
No, that was bad. I think that's among the when I think moments when the whole thing almost unraveled, and there were many. That's very high on the list. That moment when the website didn't work and it really looked like the whole thing was a catastrophe. There was a brief moment in there, I think, if the Republicans had played things a little differently, they could have probably successfully killed it. But anyway, and that all leads up to the repeal fight, right? And Trump getting elected and Republicans trying to repeal, which they've promised to do for years and years and years. But that's also the turning point, and for a couple of reasons. One I mentioned before, which is they hadn't really done the work on what that looks like. And that was important because they had adopted a rhetorical position that was impossible. And Trump was the most vivid example of this. People forget Trump campaigned on repealing the Affordable Care Act. He also campaigned on a promise to give everybody great health insurance. They did not have a plan to give everybody great health insurance. They did have plans to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
Silver unicorn or whatever, yeah.
Yeah. And, look, there's a very honest, legitimate conservative case for doing that. And there were scholars and experts who wanted to do that and who understood, though, that if you repeal the Affordable Care Act, these alternative plans, fewer people were going to have insurance. And the insurance, we'd be more back to something like the old system. Now, there were conservatives who argued that was a change for the better when you factor in everything like the cost of care and choice and whatever. And, that's a debate to have. But that is not how the program was built. Repeal was billed as giving everybody better health insurance. And in part because they hadn't done the work to really reconcile their rhetoric and their policies. And in part just because those two things were just irreconcilable. They suddenly found themselves in this position of trying to promote a plan that didn't live up to his billing. And then the other thing was, for a variety of reasons that just have to do with the nature of politics and public opinion, but also the political atmosphere of the time with this polarization. Up until that point, almost all the coverage and attention on the Affordable Care Act was on its problems. The website doesn't work. The insurance is too expensive. Too many people don't have insurance. It's, we're still dealing with the bureaucracies. The 2016 Democratic primary campaign was an argument between Hillary Clinton, who wanted to bolster the Affordable Care Act, and Bernie Sanders, who wanted to basically start over and do a Medicare for all plan. Yeah. And so there really wasn't like a lot of constituency like propping this thing up. The moment the debate actually turned to taking this thing away, two things kicked in. Number one, that resistance to change in American politics, that path dependence, that made it hard to pass.
People had things from it, right?
Yeah. It made it hard to take away. But also, like, you suddenly started to see the good parts that had gotten so little attention. And I think this was particularly an issue for Republicans for the following reason, which is that in today's media environment, the two worlds are very separate. And on the Republican side, there's a very self-contained media universe. And if you only were paying attention to Fox News, if you were only reading conservative press, all you ever heard about was like what was wrong with the Affordable Care Act. And I remember interviewing, and I quote some in my book, but talking to conservative activists, talking to Republicans who serve in Congress. And I really think they just didn't have, they believed this thing was so problematic and so bad that no one would care if it went away. And it wasn't that they were wrong about the problem so much, is that they didn't see the other half of the story. They didn't see millions of people getting insurance. And the second that you threatened to take that away, those people started showing up at town hall meetings. Yeah. I think a very important role was played by, for example, the disability community. People who depended on Medicaid, which was part of what the Republicans were trying to do, was to cut Medicaid, and really showed up in a very visible way with some very memorable protests, some of them right on Capitol Hill, some in local offices. And, that made it was very poignant. And I think suddenly this started to look very scary, and people were like, wait a minute, you're just going to take this thing away? And that's why it turned.
So there was no other plan, in part because there was really no way to repeal it without taking away some of the positive elements. And so they were a little bit stuck.
They were stuck. And look, there were plans. Don't get me wrong. There were plans. I talk a lot in the book about the proposal from Tom Price, who was a congressman and then became HHS secretary under Trump. He had a plan. Various conservative think tanks had plans. The problem was the plans didn't live up to the rhetoric. And there were multiple plans. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about, how the Democrats got ready for 2008. Democrats spent the period between like the late 1990s and the Obama presidency putting up all these different plans, getting in these meetings, saying, what are we going to do? So that they really, there was very little daylight on the broad, everyone, when Obama gets elected, 2 weeks later, it was a week later, Max Baucus, who's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which by jurisdiction is the single most important committee on healthcare, because it controls Medicare, Medicaid, taxes. He puts out a white paper outlining his idea for healthcare reform. And it is looks exactly, not exactly, but in the broad, from a distance, it's the same plan that Obama ran on in the campaign, which, by the way, is the same one that Hillary Clinton ran on in her campaign. There was one difference we can talk about later, but broadly the same. And the House Democrats also had a plan, and the Senate, and everyone had the same plan. And they were different in the details, but they were all in the same place. They'd already worked out where they were going to be. Republicans had 5 different schemes and really hadn't fleshed out any of them. And, in Congress, it's really important at some level. You just got to put yourself in the mind of a member of Congress. I'm a relatively junior representative, and I don't know all these different areas of policy, right? Because I'm dealing with 10 different things. So maybe I'm a military national security expert. I don't know about healthcare. So this has to be explained to me. I have to have had time to digest it, so that when I go to my town hall meeting, and someone's always unhappy with what I want to do when you're a member of Congress. So I'm going to go there. I need to be ready that I've thought this through. I know how to defend it. I can state my position on what I'd like to change. None of that had happened. They were not ready for this.
Hey, Young Yoon Yuk asks, how has Big Pharma impacted the policies in all of this? What role did they play? And how did it look at with ACA? And also, in thinking about universal coverage, are they part of the reason why we do, or might or might not ever get there?
Yeah. So pharma, it is certainly not wrong to suggest that pharma is the single most powerful lobby in the United States Congress. They have vast influence in both parties. More in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, but there's certainly plenty of Democrats who they have influence over. They exercise this influence in all the ways that groups like that influence. So, there's the obvious, which is their executives and their political action committees steer donations to members, lawmakers who vote the way they want. And you can argue about what the cause and effect is there. Do I get money from pharma because I voted the way pharma wants, or do I vote the way pharma wants because they gave me money? Or is it just, it's a chicken and egg thing, but that goes on. They also use their money to run advertisements. They're very good at that. They know where to advertise and who to advertise, and they're not stupid. They don't run ads that say, don't regulate drug prices, because then, CEO won't, his salary will come down.
Get as much money. Yeah.
No, they say, don't regulate drug prices, because then you won't get the next cure for cancer. And by the way, and as with any issue, there's very legitimate arguments about what's good and what's bad, how you affect innovation, et cetera. And then, there's other much more subtle ways they influence debate. They finance a lot of the sort of groups that represent patients, people with certain conditions. And there's always been this sort of questionable relationship some of them have, where some of these groups will come out against drug reforms in part because they're, possibly, we don't know, but, is it because they're getting money from the drug industry? So it's very, very powerful. They were a big factor. They were one of the lobbies that fought the Clinton plan hard, because the Clinton plan in the 90s anticipated having the US government negotiate drug prices or set drug prices, which is what all the other countries do. Remember, in every other country, part of the universal coverage plan is the government basically sets the parameters for spending. Either they set an overall level, or they dictate specific prices, or both. And that extends to drugs. And we don't do that. We've never done that.
And that's why healthcare is so expensive here.
Yes. Yes. And it's, and it's true. I mean, obviously a conservative would say that if we just went to a free market, totally, it would be much less expensive. Also, that's a whole separate debate for another session. But yes, in general, what's different? Why do we spend more than others? Because all the other countries say we're not going to spend more than X% of our GDP on healthcare, and this is how we're going to spend it. We don't do that, and so it goes up faster. And that's true for hospitals, it's true for doctors, it's true for devices, and it's true for drugs. Drugs are the one people I think hear the most about, in part because the drug industry is so profitable. It's really, hospitals run on smaller margins, for example. There are certainly rural hospitals out there that really struggle. You don't see that so much. The drug industry is a little bit of a different.
That's right. Not many mom and pop pharmaceutical.
No. And look, and to be fair, like you have startups that are like taking big risks, and that, again, that gets the innovation argument, but right. So, with the ACA, they made a decision early on that, that with all of the lobbies, but including pharma, was we can't beat these people. We're going to have to work with them. And the saying was, you're on the menu or at the table. Yeah. So basically, every industry has an interest in a more sustainable healthcare system. You all have to agree. Everyone's going to have to make some concession. But if you sit down with us and work it out, we can work together. And if you don't, we'll go to war with you. And basically every industry got on board except the insurers. The drug industry was the first in, and depending for a variety of reasons, including I think that the most powerful, they got probably the sweetest deal of all of them. And they really didn't take too much of an impact in terms of their revenue. Although they would dispute that. They would say, oh, no, we gave up lots of money. I think most people have looked at it, have said, no, I mean, especially when you take into account, they got more people with insurance, more people buying their drugs. They made out pretty well. And it's interesting, that's been an obstacle. It's not the biggest sort. I mean, if you look at sort of the sectors of the healthcare system, we spend more on hospitals than we do on drugs, but it's growing very quickly. And it's also the place where you see some really egregious examples of like, we're spending a ton of money on some drugs that don't really seem to add value. And just, it seems like, there's a strong case for controlling prices. So, interestingly enough, one of the things being debated right now in your Congress is whether finally to give the government some version of the regulatory power over prices in other countries. I mean, literally right now, as we speak, there are meetings on Capitol Hill about whether to do this. And, Chuck Schumer is holed up with Ron Wyden in the Senate Finance Committee, and maybe Kirsten Sinema, Senator, and a couple other people. And can we do this? So we'll see.
Yeah, so Tia Caldwell asked us about this this very moment. So Democrats are currently trying to pass some of the most substantial legislation since ACA. So maybe tell us a little bit more about these meetings and what else is on the table, and based on what happened with ACA, what advice would you give, and are they following the lessons of ACA too?
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because I mean, chances to do this kind of big legislation don't come along that often. Seems to be roughly every decade plus few years.
That's right.
Give or
Good
take.
point. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we 93, 94, 09, 10, and now 2001, 2022. And Democrats were extremely leaders, both in the White House and Congress, were very consciously trying not to make the same mistakes they made last time. Part because they were all around then, right? I mean, Joe Biden was in the White House when they did, the ACA. Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. Chuck Schumer was, in Senate leadership. They were all there. They all remember this. And, they took a bunch of lessons. One is, I think they've learned from the political trajectory of the last 10 years. I just think the ACA was very much premised on getting Republican buy-in, which they all thought they could get. I mean, they never thought they were going to like half the Republicans in the Senate to vote for it, but there was a very genuine belief at the beginning of the ACA effort they would pass something that would get 2, 3, maybe as many as 8 or 9 Republican senators on board, and a decent number in the House as well. And that did not happen in the end.
Yeah,
And I think that was
persisted for a long time. They held to that. So
they did. They
Well,
believed, some more than others.
yeah.
The one who believed it the most was the one who had to kind of control the process for a long time. That was Max Baucus. So that did drag things out a bit. I think this time there was very little expectation that would happen. So from the beginning, the Democrats decided they would do this on their own. It helps, even though their majority is smaller, it's more cohesive and more homogenous than it was. I mean, it's a funny thing that, Obama at the peak of his presidency had 60 senators, enough to break a filibuster. And now there's 50, which means you literally can't lose a single one if it's a party line vote. But if you look at the number of, for lack of a better word, liberal Democratic senators, there's more now than there were then.
Interesting.
Because back then you had a bunch of, people forget, you had like two Democrats from Arkansas and Louisiana and North Dakota. You had, places that Democrats don't win anymore. And there's really no one like that left in the Senate except for Joe Manchin. He's the lone. And John Tester of Montana but Montana's always been quirky politically.
Sort of does its own thing.
Yeah. So, they've definitely tried to, they tried to learn a lesson, and we see that, they're moving ahead on their own. They're trying to move quickly. They are trying to focus on things they can do quickly and deliver quickly to get results. They are trying not to get overly caught up on the sort of, they're trying to do things that are politically difficult, like this. I mean, the ACA, part of what made healthcare so hard is that you are, even with some of the ACA, you're still disrupting, right? You're still changing things to some extent. And very little of what's under discussion right now involves actively changing existing things. It's mostly just adding, right? It's spending money on this or spending money on this or something. There's some in the, I mean, I don't want to say that's not totally the case, but like mostly you're sort of adding programs. So that's a little easier to do politically. I think what they're discovering, though, is that some of these things are a little easier said than done. They want to move quickly. They want to be done already. They're not. Why are they not done? Because they have a handful of sort of more conservative members to deal with. Oh, wait, that's exactly what happened with the ACA.
Yeah.
This is complex. I also think there's they're stuffing everything into this reconciliation bill. And it's a weird situation because it's not one thing. Right, this bill is like 10 things, and that makes it. I don't know how that. I don't know if it helps or hurts politically, because on the one hand, it's hard to describe to people and defend. Right. On the other hand, given the way these debates play out, like politically, honestly, like I'm not sure it's always helpful to have one thing be the focus. I do think it's not a great way to legislate. I just think you're moving along very quickly, and it's just not good practice. On the other hand, I'm not sure there's an alternative in a world where, frankly, where you're, from the get-go that the Senate's going to get, we have this, the way the filibuster has evolved, we've turned the Senate into a 60-vote body, and that's not how it was intended to be, but it makes it very hard to get anything done. So you end up going through this reconciliation process, which means you only have, you only get a couple shots a year to do it.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
So Lydia Rose Thornburg is asking if Congress is going to do one thing, if it's not going to do everything in the Build Back Better plan, well, what are you hoping most to see?
We were talking about this earlier. So I don't feel like that's. I don't know that I can or should even be like, that's not for me to answer. And I'll say why, because I have reported on a number of these. I don't cover some of them, but my lane is like social welfare, right? So I've written about the early childhood portion. So there's a proposal to do childcare, there's a proposal to do pre-K. I know a lot about the child tax credit, which is not my beat, but it's related. And Luke, you know all about that. That's been your work for so long. I've written a lot about a proposal for what's called home and community-based services, which is basically for people who are elderly or people who have disabilities. Enables them, among things, to stay out of nursing homes, but also to sort of participate more fully, like go to college, keep down a job. I've written about everything in the healthcare space, prescription drugs, getting Medicaid to the states that didn't expand Medicaid, making the ACA more generous, which is what they should have, wanted to do in the first place. Um, boy, and and Medicare adding a dental benefit, which it's never had, and vision and hearing. Like I talk to people, like every one of these, there's a like really compelling group of people who make a case that this would really be life changing for them. If all, and and politically, it's very hard to know what's better and what's worse. And look, every one of these has got their pros and cons. Every one of them, there's people who think it's a really terrible policy idea, and more of that on the right. But even on the left, there's people like, oh, this is like. Just recently, we've been talking about the child care plan. There's a real discussion going on, like some people coming from the left of like, what are we doing here? This doesn't look like a very good plan. So, I don't know. I find it very hard to prioritize. And not that I find it hard to say we should do one or two. I'm not even, there's a big meta debate going on. Should they just do a handful of things and do them really well? Or should they do as many things as possible, even if they have to do them all kind of halfway? I don't even know what the right answer is there. I find this very complicated. So. Yeah. Sorry to dodge the question, but
so there were a couple of things. Was there anything, Emily Waldman's asking, were there things that the Trump administration sort of rescinded that still need to be brought back? Have those all been sort of brought back? Anything sort of under administrative action? So I was thinking mainly they didn't get anything done, but
right. So one of the really interesting things about the Trump administration was, obviously legislatively, they were trying desperately to repeal it, and that failed. They did succeed in repealing the individual mandate, which turned out not to be the blow many people thought it would be. And we can talk about, that's another discussion for why that happened. And did that mean the mandate never mattered? That's a whole other conversation. There was a very clear intent that Trump made fairly explicit that he was looking to kind of wreck the plan, or at least neglect it into out of existence. And that was like, I think, his intent. But, Trump, to put it mildly, was not the most focused on policy. And how that directive got translated was interesting because of two things. Number one, you had people who I think in the sort of lower down in the administration who definitely wanted to repeal it and didn't like the program, but also felt like, I should make it work. Their idea of how to make it work, I think, is very different than how a liberal would think it should work. But, they took steps that, more changed the nature of the program than hurt it. And then one of the big things they did was very famously, Trump, there was a complex set of payments built into the way the law works. It was like one of these back end deals that the government would pay the insurers and whatever. And basically, he stopped paying them. Just they cut off the money. And the theory was this, I think there was a thought that this was a blow against Obamacare. Ironically, what ended up happening is that in reaction to this, state regulators and the insurers reconfigured the way they price things. And the end result was the assistance actually became more generous, which I don't think was the intent, but it worked out that way. And actually people got a better deal because of it. So, the big things that they did that have since been undone, the two things were, the Biden administration has really put a lot of money into promoting it. They reopened, it's partly because it's a public health emergency and just throw everything at the wall. Like they opened up enrollment, they got a boost and they made it more generous in ways they hope to make permanent. And they've also started to clamp down. The one thing I do think is an issue is the Trump administration really opened the door to these alternative insurance plans that they're not available to everyone with pre-existing conditions, or they don't cover everything. And they're cheaper because they don't do as much, but there's real danger for a lot of people. They don't know what they're buying, and then they get stuck with big medical bills. And so the Biden administration is in the process of trying to undo that.
Hey, I've got one more minute. You did mention vision and dental, and we had a question early on about like why have those never been included in this kind of package? Do you have a 1 minute answer to that kind of question?
Medicare was created based on a 1965 model of insurance, and to add benefits wholesale, Congress has to act. That's hard. No matter what you do, it's hard. It's and so with dental, we're dealing with this right now, this proposal. Why is it hard? Dentists are opposed to it, a lot of them, because they think it's going to lower their fees. And it costs money. You got to find the money somewhere. Yeah.
Jonathan Cohn, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. I learned a lot. It was really great to talk to you and talk about the long scope of history and also what's happening right now. So this is Jonathan's book, The 10-Year War. Pick it up, and it's such a great read. Jonathan, thanks again for the book and for being with us.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and hello to everyone in the University of Michigan community. Go Blue.